Hello and welcome at our GCP-Mindset channel. The topic of today is sponsorship of clinical trials, and I have the expert Andreas Beuys with me.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Andy, once again, welcome. Last time we met here was the topic biostatistics, and now we speak about something completely different. Yeah? Can you explain us why you're an expert in sponsorship for clinical trials?
Well, I think, of course, there were personal changes on my level. Now I'm the CEO of GCP-Service, so it comes with different responsibilities. But that's only one part. I think we've also changed a lot in terms of clinical trial regulations, especially in the European Union. We have a new clinical trial regulation, we have the new medical device regulation, and the IVDR will also become applicable soon. So the landscape in which clinical trials are conducted has changed dramatically over the last years. And that has also impacted the ability of a lot of companies to take over the sponsorship responsibility in clinical trials. Trials are complex as is, and with regulations becoming more complex and us not really moving back towards an easier time, we have just much more to do and much more to take care of. And it's a risk, and that just means that there is a need for someone to, at times, jump in and take this over as a service. And we provide that, and therefore we've also gained the experience in it, and we are here to talk about it today.
Okay, Andy, very interesting. But let's be honest, most people don't know anything about development of drugs or medical devices. Therefore, could you give them a little bit more an idea what is a sponsor of a clinical trial? It's not just paying money, it's something different.
Yeah, it's actually quite understandable that people think that sponsor is basically the same as the one that provides the money. And in a lot of cases, that's also true. But in clinical research, we have a clear regulatory definition of what a sponsor is and should do. And the sponsor in a clinical trial is the person or the, let's say, institute, the company that basically takes penultimate responsibility for everything done in a clinical trial, from patient safety to regulatory compliance to ensuring that the sites are in line with the study protocol to ensuring quality to data integrity. All of these elements are strictly regulated, and making sure that these regulations are upheld is the responsibility of the sponsor. And if things go wrong, then it is also the sponsor's responsibility to deal with that.
Okay, but in theory it could also be a single person, correct?
In theory, it could be a single person, but of course you need the processes and you need to be able to fulfill the requirements. So if it's not feasible for you to do everything on your own, then you cannot be the sponsor in itself.
Okay, then it's more the responsibility and less the money.
Yes.
I can imagine that most people would think that paying the money is a difficult part because people are lacking money, especially in such hard crises like in the moment. But actually, that is not the case. In many cases, taking over the responsibility for something is much harder than paying the money, especially when you have the money. What do you think?
Well, honestly, I think it depends sometimes a little bit on the person, but I would agree with you that taking over responsibility is much harder than having to just pay the bills. Of course, if you are responsible for the money at the end of the day, you also have a responsibility to make sure that you invest it wisely, and every clinical trial is an investment because you want something out of it. So naturally, that also comes with its own pressure. So I'm not saying that there is none, but taking over the responsibility, of course, comes with a huge deal of work and of taking over responsibility for each individual task, not in executing it, but in ensuring that the outcome is adequate. And I think that can add a lot of pressure because there are so many factors that are beyond your control. And so sometimes it can be easier to just give away the money and expect a certain return and having someone else responsible. But it needs a trustful relationship that you understand you will get something in return for giving your money. And as long as that balance is there, I would say at the end of the day, probably it is easier to be the one that's giving the money than the one that's taking over the responsibility.
Okay, let's imagine you would be the investor. To whom would you not give the money?
Well, I would not give the money to someone that I don't fully trust will execute to the level that I expected. But I'm a person that is sometimes too hands-on with certain elements. I understand that for myself. I want a certain level of control and oversight, and if it's not there, I will have an issue. So if I give money to someone, I expect in return full transparency to give me an overview of how the process is also going, and for me to feel confident that things are going in the right way and in the right progress.
Yeah, but wouldn't that make you to the sponsor?
Well, in the end, of course, I need to be in the background. I cannot be hands-on. I don't take over the responsibility. I would just like to be informed. So yes, being too hands-on as a financier makes you the sponsor at the end. If you're decision-making, if you're signing off on individual, I don't know, the study protocol, individual study plans, then of course you take over too much responsibility. That's not the idea of it. But in the end, there needs to be a clear understanding that you give money for an outcome. And so as someone that gives money, I would want to be informed over the outcome of the project that I'm financing without taking responsibility for exactly how it is produced and in which manner.
Okay, according to my understanding, that would mean when you give the money, you're not allowed to make any essential decisions, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Who are typically your clients?
Well, small companies aside that just don't have the quality management system or don't have the logistics to support a clinical trial. The ones that are profiting most from having this outsourcing model for sponsorship are actually investigators. In the past, a lot of research, actually probably the majority of research, was conducted in so-called investigator-initiated trials, where investigators have an idea for, let's say, an indication expansion for an existing medication, and they discuss with the manufacturer whether they can use their drug in a trial. And for that, sort of like gain additional knowledge on the application of such drug. And they still do that, but the requirements are becoming more and more stringent. And at times it is difficult for the associated research institutes, university clinics or so on, to take over the sponsorship responsibility for these trials then, especially if the trials are across borders and there is complexities in local clinical trial regulations. And therefore, these are really the projects that we can support the most, where there's really like just a gap and no one would like to take over sponsorship responsibility, and sometimes the marketing authorization holder, if it's already a marketed drug, or the manufacturer, also cannot or doesn't want to take over that responsibility, but could provide the drug and maybe a little bit of financing for the data. And here we can then support as a chaperone and help get these trials going and help support them so that they can actually be conducted according to our current trial regulations.
Okay, so for IIT, for me it sounds very logical, because I heard already from the industry that they don't like to support them anymore because of the unprofessional way of conducting clinical studies. And on the other side, I heard already from university professors who actually have done it in the past, who are not willing to take over the responsibility anymore because of all the bureaucratic hurdles.
Yeah.
So it makes sense, of course. But beside the IITs, do you support other companies with this kind of service?
Well, for extremely small companies that, for example, don't have a quality management system in place yet to run a clinical trial according to the regulations, this could also be a good stepping stone. Of course, I would say as a company, there is much more of a need to establish such a system of actually being able to supervise all of your processes anyway. If you are, let's say, the IP holder for your product, you're the manufacturer, you are the marketing authorization holder, eventually you need a quality management system in place. So unless there are serious issues with like staff and resources to conduct it, I think the opportunities are more rare, let's say, for us to support also in that field.
Okay, and you call it sponsorship as a service. For me, it sounds very useful. Yeah, when you see all these very small companies with maybe 5 to 10 people who are not able to take over the responsibility, that you deliver something like a bridge to conduct the study according to the regulations, and you're the sponsor and you're taking over the responsibility. But what does it mean for you then? How does your service look like? So,
taking aside all of the tasks that you do within a clinical trial, as a sponsor, what you eventually need to do is have oversight over a clinical trial. And that means that in all steps you don't execute as a sponsorship as a service, you don't execute the tasks yourself, but you need to make sure that they are in line with all of the regulations. And that starts from how the protocol is drafted, making sure that this is in line with regulations, to the entire submission process, to getting the sites on board and everything. These steps need someone that oversees it and that directs the entire clinical trial and makes sure that it's in line with the expectation and delivers on the timelines and the scope that is intended for the clinical trial. And basically it means that we can take over this responsibility, completely remove it and run it under our quality management system, so that the client only has their product and provides the money. And then the rest of the responsibility is covered by us, and we are also the ones that are corresponding then with the authorities as necessary.
Okay. But why shouldn't small, tiny organizations not use your service then? Are they afraid of any patents or publication rights?
Well, in our contracts, of course, we don't care about these elements. They are definitely residing with the clients. And the same is also true for any publication rights and so on. We are understanding ourselves as a means to an end, as a chaperone, as someone that enables these trials to even happen in the first place, because otherwise the hurdles would be too high. We are not interested in getting the intellectual property or having publication rights. Of course, we're happy to support everything that is contracted to us, but in the end these are not elements that we want for ourselves. So contractually we would leave all of that with our clients.
Okay, and what's your experience up to now? I mean, sponsorship as a service is quite new, I think. I haven't heard it that often yet. And I can imagine that also competent authorities, ethics committees, but also the industry has problems with the understanding of what it really means.
Well, from our experience so far, actually, for ethics committees and competent authorities, it has not been so much of a problem, because in the end, you still have an industry-sponsored study, because we are not a research institute, so it doesn't change anything in the legal framework. So far everything is sort of like good on that end. And yes, absolutely, for our clients, it sometimes becomes, I mean, it is something they are not used to, and that really reflects in the initial discussions, because of course, this is such an immense responsibility that handing over that amount of responsibility requires a large amount of trust, and that can only be gained gradually. So I think it is most important to really take this process also slow and discuss it thoroughly, and at the beginning especially being extremely communicative. I mentioned earlier that it's sort of like a financier provides the money and the rest of the responsibility remains with the sponsor. That's true, but it is a process in which I think it's really important to communicate a lot at the beginning still, and also involve the financier in the background in some of the processes, so that they can gain the trust of it. Because you cannot just kickstart such a process immediately and say, well, we take over your most valued responsibility from you. You wouldn't also like just randomly hand your kids to a stranger. I think for a lot of companies, this can feel the same way, because their product is their baby and they are supposed to handle the penultimate responsibility for it to another company. And so what we do is we discuss a lot and we establish a lot of pathways of communication, of sharing information, of making sure that things happen in alignment with the ideas of the financier, while still maintaining all of the control of the processes.
Okay, so sponsorship as a service is like a babysitting service. Yeah, and you would also use a very trustful babysitter instead of just somebody who's taking care of your kids.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, when you would meet with organizations, yeah, tiny organizations or investigators who want to start a study, and they are not completely sure if your service would be something for them, what would be your recommendation for them? How should they check if they can do the sponsorship by themselves, or if they should outsource it to you?
I would start by asking them 3 questions. The first one is, do you have people that have time to invest into this study and this project? Especially in small companies, everyone really does everything, and especially medical device companies, you usually have like 4 or 5 job roles at the same time. So do you really have the time to invest into it, or do you have people that can do it? The second should be, do these people that have time also have the right amount of experience to take over that responsibility? And then lastly, is your quality management system up to par? Because because there are a lot of requirements that need to be met. It is rather standardized to some extent. And if you don't meet these requirements, it's a severe risk for you as a manufacturer, as a company. So, and if you're confident with all three of those, that's really good. But if you have some questions or concerns with either of these points, then you should consider whether outsourcing isn't the right model for you. And when it comes to investigators, on top of that, I would also ask, what is the legal framework in your institute? Because a lot of institutes would potentially have the resources, but they don't have the, let's say, legal team behind it that would support conduct of such a study. And sometimes the question can be, do you have the 9 to 18 months to deal with your legal department before the study starts for them to really be comfortable taking over the sponsorship responsibility? Or would you rather outsource it, so therefore this question no longer needs to get asked? And so these are sort of like the 4 points, I guess, that you could go through when considering such a service.
Okay, Andy, for me it sounds everything very logic, and it of course makes also clinical trials possible, which are otherwise not possible and will not be even started because very small companies or investigators or university clinics are just not able to take over the responsibility, or they are not willing to do it. Yeah? Do I understand correctly?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And this is also where we feel we can add a lot of value to our clients. And this is in the end what we always look at. We don't want to be the biggest, but we want to be someone that adds a lot of value to our clients. And especially these studies that never happen if we don't help out, these are the ones that we really feel a lot of passion for. So we are happy to provide this as a service, and we are looking forward to seeing where this develops to also in the future.
Yeah, clients, but also patients. I mean, they profit at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much for explaining us the sponsor as a service. And
sure. I
hope that you also liked our video. Yeah. Leave your comments on our YouTube channel, subscribe our channel, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.